Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar for today. We know that many of you logged in live. We had a few technical difficulties, but the show must go on, so we're recording this and we're pushing it out to everybody. And on this slide, we just have an overview of our learning objectives for today, and we have two of them. The first is to provide all of the participants with an overview of the comply chain application, which you'll be hearing about, and then second, to provide an understanding of how comply chain and the Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template, which we will also be talking about, can complement each other. So let's go to our next slide, please. We've scheduled today's webinar for a little under an hour, and I'm not going to read through everything that's on our agenda slide here. A lot of this tracks what's on those first two learning objectives that we talked about, but the one item that I do want to mention on this slide is the Q&A. Anybody who's listening in to today's webinar will be able to send us by email any questions that they have, which we're more than happy to follow up with people on. And then also we will be, during the course of this webinar, covering some of the questions that we received in advance of the program. Okay, so just a little bit about our speakers today. I'm Michael Littenberg. I'm a partner at Ropes Gray. I head up our CSR and supply chain compliance practice. We have what I think is the largest practice in the area. We have over 200 companies we're working with on a variety of different areas of their CSR programs, and we have professionals in the practice that are in the United States, Europe, and Asia. And I don't want to turn this into an infomercial today, so I won't go into more detail on our practice, but certainly feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to hear more. With us today, we're pleased to have Rachel Phillips Rigby, and I'll let Rachel introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I want to thank Ashley at Ascent Compliance for your collaboration in setting up this webinar. It's really a pleasure to be here alongside you today, Michael. And I also want to give special thanks to my colleague, Pablo Solorio, who's been really involved in getting this webinar set up as well. So I got involved with the Social Responsibility Alliance and started participating in the STRT Development Committee just as an observer after hearing about it through one of its members, Ascent Compliance. I have really been impressed with the dedication and commitment of the committee members to creating a tool that is robust, yet feasible for a wide variety of users. And I think many of those logging in or listening have seen that tool. So we're going to be looking more closely at that today. To give you all a little background on me, the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking sits within the U.S. Department of Labor's International Bureau. Since our founding in 1995, we have grown to be the world's leading funder of grant projects around the world to combat exploitative child labor, working in over 80 countries. We also fund projects to address forced labor and the trafficking of adults worldwide. And in addition to that grant funding, we have a team, which Pablo and I are part of, that funds and carries out research and data collection on these issues around the world and produces some flagship reports. Those include Comply Chain, which is the focus of today's webinar.
So I think before we get started, I just want to say a little bit about the Social Responsibility Alliance. The SRA is the sponsor of today's webinar. So the Social Responsibility Alliance was founded in 2017. It's a multi-stakeholder consortium of organizations from industry, academia, and various service professions. The SRA is focused on providing companies with open source tools and other resources and support to build socially responsible supply chains through the collection of responsible sourcing data. And one of these tools is the Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template, or STRT, which we're going to be talking about later in the presentation. And Rachel, let me turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. So what you see here are the covers of U.S. Department of Labor's 3 flagship reports I mentioned earlier. So you may be familiar with these, or maybe not. The first one is our findings on the worst forms of child labor. It is an annual report covering 140 countries and territories. It provides an overview of the situation of child labor in each country, as well as the efforts of each country's government to address the worst forms of child labor through laws, law enforcement, coordination, policies, and programs. The second report you see pictured is our list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor. This report is produced biannually, and the next edition will be coming out later this year, so look for that. The current edition, which was published in 2016, includes 139 goods from 79 countries that we believe are produced by child labor or forced labor. And the third report is similar. It's a subset of the goods in the second report. This is our list of goods produced by forced or indentured child labor. Under US government procurement rules, entities selling the goods on this list to the government must certify that they have made a good faith effort to ensure that the goods were not produced by forced child labor. So I just wanted to make you aware of those publications, and they are all available on a free app called Sweat and Toil, which you can find from our website. We know that many companies use them in doing risk assessment and due diligence, and numerous third parties such as Maplecroft and many others use them in constructing their country and sector risk ratings. Here's a snapshot of some of our findings from the list of goods. So I mentioned there's 139 goods, 75 countries, nearly 400 different line items. You see that a majority of the goods produced by child or forced labor are in agriculture, but there's quite a few in manufacturing, mining and quarrying, and so on. And you can also see that some of the goods with the highest number of countries would be like sugarcane, where we have a finding that 19 countries have either child or forced labor in sugarcane production. Gold, 22 countries. Bricks, 19 countries. So that gives you kind of a sense. And after the webinar, I'm certainly happy to walk through details of our findings with anyone who's interested. Just feel free to reach out to me. So before we move into Comply Chain and the Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template, which are tools to address forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery, I think it makes sense to really quickly review what these concepts mean. So of course, there are international conventions and treaties that define these concepts. Most importantly, there are International Labor Organizations Conventions 29 and 105 on forced labor, and the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, also known as the Palermo Protocol, and the UN Slavery Convention. I'm not going to get into the legal definitions today, but I think it is important to know that there are legal distinctions between the concepts of forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery. However, as you and I work to address these issues in practice, I think the distinctions aren't as important. They are all grave human rights abuses characterized by overlapping types of exploitation. So I'm going to use the words, whether I say forced labor or modern slavery or trafficking today, I'm using them interchangeably, even though technically they have legal differences. I do want to draw your attention to a resource that's pictured on the screen. We use this resource continually on our team. It is an ILO publication called Hard to See, Harder to Count. And this guide lists many of the indicators of forced labor, things like deceptive and coercive recruitment, confiscation of identity documents, physical abuse, threats used to coerce workers, forced overtime beyond legal limits, limitations on worker freedom of movement, dependency on employers for food and lodging, delayed payment, debt bondage, and many other things. So this resource lists many of them, and if you could flip to the next page, there's more. So there's a listing of a different categorization of indicators that when you take some of these things together, a worker is in forced labor if they're subjected to two or more of them. And that's sometimes not well understood, that forced labor, slavery, and trafficking doesn't necessarily just look like a worker in chains or a worker who isn't able to, is entrapped in their workplace. There are many other forms that forced labor can take. Okay, moving on. So this brings me to the main focus, the Comply Chain application. So this app is our only publication written predominantly with a business audience in mind, and that's the audience on our webinar today. So I'm really happy to be speaking to you. Like all of you, we have certainly noticed an uptick in the business community's interest in addressing modern slavery in recent years. It is one of the hot topics at every conference I go to. And what is driving this interest? I would say certainly increased media coverage of the issues, and as well as a rise in litigation against companies for alleged complicity in these abuses. We've seen that a lot lately, and I don't expect it to go down. In the app, we actually have a section that goes into the drivers. Why are companies interested in this topic? And the reasons why a company should want to develop a social compliance system. So this screen can be found from our main page, and I'll show you how to navigate to that. But if you ever need, within your company or as you're talking to different business units within the company, some of the reasons why you need to make a case for working on modern slavery within your company. We list quite a few here. Not only the laws and regulations that are increasingly growing in importance, but also company reputation, civil society and shareholder pressure, media coverage, employee recruitment and retention, and many others. Next slide. So this is the framework that our app is built around. It is 8 steps to a social compliance system. In the app, you can click on any of these 8 buttons and be brought to the home page for that step. From there, you can navigate through all the content sequentially or explore the topics in whatever order you want. The app is set up as a training, so for those who wish to start at step 1 and work systematically through to step 8, they can do that. But it is also modular, so those who are just seeking information on certain topics can go directly to step 7 or 3 or what have you. I'll just show you the home page for each step so you can see what they are. This is the home page for the whole app. So from here you click into steps to a social compliance system, and then you'll see the 8 steps. If you click into step 1, this one is engaging stakeholders and partners. Each step is organized in the same way. So you'll see at the top, learning objectives for the step, then key terms for that step, and then a listing of the topics covered in that step. And the topics are hyperlinked, so you could jump through that section to go just to the topics that you might be interested in. And then each step ends with further resources. So we try to offer a lot of external resources, both at the end of each step in the further resources section, and then also throughout the steps, you'll see real life company examples, and you can click on those to find out, to be taken out of the app and find out more about that particular company effort. Okay, step 2. This one focuses on assessing risks and impacts in your supply chain, so risks of forced labor, trafficking, and modern slavery. And you can just see there and get a quick look at what the subtopics are, such as supply chain mapping, assessing risks, data management, and so on. Next step. Step 3, developing a code of conduct. Many companies already have a code of conduct. Many don't. So this is an example of the different ways our app can be used. One of our subtopics here is, what are the standards that should be in any code on child labor and forced labor? If you don't have that yet, this provides that. If you already have that, but you don't necessarily know that your code is top-notch in terms of addressing some of the subtler issues like migrant labor, we also go into some of those topics for you. So it's a way to maybe refine your code. It's also a way to engage with supply chain partners if they don't have a code. Step 4 is called communicating and training across your supply chain. So once you have those standards and policies in place, how to engage with supply chain partners to make sure they get trained. And capacity building is such a big and important part of social compliance. So we talk about that in depth here. Step 5, monitoring. Whether you call it monitoring or auditing or something else, this is that section, and it's fairly extensive. We talk about what makes an auditing program good, what makes an auditor good, what skills do they need, what are the steps. Then we get into some topics that are very specific to our areas of expertise, child labor and forced labor. So how should a child be approached in the context of an audit, for example, or homework? I know a lot of you, well, maybe not a lot of you, but some companies grapple with the fact that there is homework deeper into the tiers of their supply chain. So how can that be detected through an audit? Step 6, remediation of violations. So we provide some ideas and resources on if a victim of one of these labor abuses is found, what should you do? What should be your next steps? Step 7 covers independent review. If you're really trying for a top-notch social compliance program, how can you have an independent party review it and provide feedback and make sure that it meets your expectations? Step 8 focuses on reporting. We give a lot of examples from different companies' CSR reports and talk about what should be included in reporting. And this has a lot of tie-ins with many of those transparency requirements that are now out there. Many of you may be required to disclose your efforts to combat modern slavery, either by the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act or other laws in other jurisdictions. And so I know that many companies have been thinking a lot about how do they report these things. Okay, I think I'm going to turn it back briefly over to Michael.
Thanks, Rachel. And Rachel, great job. And I have the easy job today. I just have to moderate and interject a little bit here and there. So we're going to go to the second half of our webinar today, which is going to focus on understanding how the Comply Chain app and the Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template complement each other. And what I want to do on this slide is just talk a little bit about the STRT. We've given you a little bit of an overview on the Social Responsibility Alliance, or the SRA, which is developing and continues to update the template. But in terms of the STRT itself, so it's a free Excel-based template. It's designed to assist companies in their efforts to comply with human trafficking and modern slavery legislation, including public disclosure requirements. The STRT can be used to collect data from suppliers in a standardized, consistent format, which is, makes this a much easier exercise for companies. And then following the collection of data, the data can be used by companies to then help assess modern slavery risk in their supply chains. So much broader than just helping companies to deal with their disclosure requirements, but also helping them to substantively address modern slavery risk. I'm not going to do a deep dive on the STRT today. Rachel's going to be going into it in some more detail. The one thing that I do want to note is that in addition to the 20 questions that are in the declaration piece of the STRT, the template also has country and industry tabs for the respondent, which then can help the recipients to assess risk by geography and industry. So with that overview, Rachel, let me turn it back over to you to talk a little bit more about Comply Chain and then how that more specifically aligns with some of what's in the STRT. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Michael. So some of the participants may be current users of the STRT and some may not. So what we're going to do is sort of cross-reference sections of the STRT to sections of Comply Chain so that you can figure out how they complement each other and see which one you might want to use to assist your efforts with the other. First, questions 9 to 11 of the STRT. So these focus on the topic of risk identification and management. Does your company perform formal screening and evaluation of prospective recruiters to see if they operate in compliance with the law? Does your company engage in verification activities to assess and manage risks, and so on? So what can Comply Chain do to help answer these questions and help identify risks and manage them? Next slide. Step 2 of Comply Chain addresses assessing risks and impacts. So what we get into here is why should you conduct risk and impact assessments and how. Next slide. We have a whole section, and I know this is probably hard to read, but you can just navigate to the app itself to get into the information. And you can actually see the crumb trail at the very top left that shows you where in the app to find this particular content, but it should be pretty easy to find. So this is our subsection on risk and impact information gathering. We provide resources at the top on where can you start to look at what your risks are. We have examples of different kinds of sources of risk information. There's certainly the reports that I mentioned earlier that our team produces and a lot of companies use. There are also other US government reports that I can recommend. There's media sources, and there's NGOs and third-party service providers and many other resources where you can find this type of risk information. We list a lot of that here. We also talk about what risks are you looking at? You know, what are the things that could make your supply chain more vulnerable to modern slavery, such as migrant workers in the supply chain? So this is just a short snapshot. The content in this section is much longer, but this just gives you an idea of where to look for key risk factors. Next slide. Okay, so questions 6 and 7 from the STRT are on policy. What policies does your company have in place? Does your company issue and enforce policies prohibiting these various indicators, like I mentioned before, indicators of modern slavery? Withholding identity or immigration documents, using recruiters that don't comply with local laws, charging recruitment fees, procuring commercial sex acts during the length of a contract. And question 7 lists another set of risk factors. Next slide. So in step 3 of comply chain, we have a lot of resources on policy. So what should, if you are putting a policy in place, what should that policy say? And what makes a really strong policy? And we have examples there of companies who have them in place. And just on the side, I was just engaging with a large footwear company in the last couple of weeks. And I won't say their name on this webinar, but I'm happy to have one-on-one conversations with folks later. But I was looking through their policies and their vendor requirements, and they were really strong in the area of child and forced labor. So I think we really see a lot of really good practice out there, and it's growing. So even the examples that we have in comply chain, there have been more that have continued to evolve since we published it. And so that's one reason why I'd be happy to stay in touch with people who want to reach out to me, and I can give you great examples of really good codes, really good expectation documents that companies are sharing with their supply chain partners in the area of child and forced labor that are gold standard, that you could copy or try to emulate, or at least learn some lessons from. Next slide. So here's a subsection, what makes a good code of conduct? And I mentioned we do have a few specific company examples here, Levi Strauss, Coca-Cola, Starbucks. And we get into the details, what should the content be? What should it say on child and forced labor? Next slide. So every code pretty much says there should be no child labor, but what does that mean? And so this gets into that. In terms of forced labor and trafficking, again, most codes would prohibit involuntary labor or forced labor, but what about the deeper nuances? And I just want to spotlight something on this slide here, a practice that Hewlett-Packard Enterprise has put in place of trying to transition as many of the migrant workers in their supply chain as possible to direct employment by their employer, instead of workers being employed by a third-party recruitment agent, because that has been found to be a way to mitigate the risks of migrant workers ending up in forced labor. We also have this tool pictured in the bottom right of the slide, the responsible sourcing tool. So this is a whole suite of tools produced by the organization Verite with US government funding, and they are open source just like the STRT. I think they are also a really good complement to the STRT. It's basically a package of examples and templates, sample code of conduct provisions that basically feed you what your code of conduct should say on trafficking in persons. And there are some other tools in there as well that I think are really strong. Next slide. This just continues that responsible sourcing tool sample code of conduct. But we don't need to get into depth on it here. I just want you to know that it's there. Next slide. I referenced that We provide a variety of examples and details on how to address the vulnerability of migrants to modern slavery. And then we also have examples of specific companies and what they're doing. So that, for example, Patagonia's migrant worker standards are in here. And maybe some of you are familiar with the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, which is a coalition, and it has led by the Institute for Human Rights in Business, and they are urging companies to sign on to commit to allowing zero recruitment fees paid by workers throughout their supply chain. So that might be something you're ready for or not, but it's a great thing to learn about and aspire to. Next slide. Let's skip past this one since I think we already talked a little bit about the drivers. Okay, moving into the next section of the STRT, question 16 through 20 on public disclosure. So these questions help companies understand if their suppliers are required to produce public disclosures or compliance plans pursuant to the US federal acquisition regulations on trafficking in persons. So these would be companies that sell to the US government. These can act as added insight for companies to understand if their suppliers are compliant and what their social compliance programs look like. Additionally, the STRT overall can be used to inform modern slavery statements as well as general CSR reports, provide metrics on KPIs, identification of salient risks, etc. So public disclosure in supply chain. We have a section talking about why produce public reporting. And if you're looking to improve your CSR report or one or more of your mandatory disclosures, this step walks through public reporting on labor and social compliance issues. It contains a lot of specific examples of companies who are doing various aspects of public reporting really well. So I encourage you to look further into that section. Next slide. Questions 12 through 14 of the STRT. Question 12 helps users assess if adequate training is taking place of their supply chain partners. And questions 13 to 14 look at whether there are grievance mechanisms in place for workers or community members. So these are both indicators of needs within a supply chain. Next slide. On the training question, question 12 of STRT, we have some resources in Comply Chain Step 4, which is called Communication and Training. So it covers what should training look like, what are good resources, who should be trained, what should be the focus of the training, what considerations should be in place when you're training a particular audience. And I do have, even aside from what's in Comply Chain, I've recently learned just through engaging with companies about some really interesting training models that they're using for training their supply chain partners. So again, I'm happy to share ideas with anyone who reaches out to me. And then skip ahead. Next slide, a couple slides later. Basically, the resources that we're moving through are just all the details that I mentioned on training different audiences within your supply chain. But I just also wanted to get back to STRT questions 13 and 14 on grievance mechanisms. I wanted to point out to you this grievance mechanism section of Comply Chain, where we highlight why is it important to have a grievance mechanism, what are some examples of providers that are out there who are doing good work in this area. And this is really kind of a hot topic, I think, grievance mechanisms. And I think it's part of a broader conversation that a lot of groups are having around worker voice. How do the traditional model of social compliance is more focused on auditing and gathering information that's gathered by an auditor. And some have felt that what that does is not leave adequate room for ground up or bottom up opportunities for workers to raise their own voices. And so there are many companies who are looking for ways to do both. They still want to audit, they still want to ensure compliance through their compliance program and their auditing and their remediation, but also how can we leave the door open to hearing the voices of workers that might not show up through an audit. And so we do highlight some of those resources here. And there have been some studies done by multilateral organizations, NGOs, and so on what makes a really effective grievance mechanism. I don't think anyone has found the silver bullet yet, but there's a lot of work going on in this area. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We have reached the question period, so I'll turn it over to Michael.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And so we're going to cover some of the questions that we received in advance of the live program. But before we do that, as I mentioned before, for those of you who are listening to this program on replay, we are happy to answer any questions that you have. If you want to, you can send those to the SRA at their website. The website is socialresponsibilityalliance.org. Again, that's socialresponsibilityalliance.org. And when you go to that website, there's a pull down for a contact us pull down. And if you go to that pull down, then you can just type your question in there and somebody will get back to you either verbally or by email with a response. And then, of course, in addition to reaching out to either Rachel or myself, if you go to the SRA's website, you'll also see all of the members of the development committee, and you can certainly feel free to reach out to any of them with any questions about the STRT. So with that, let's go to some of the questions that came in, and I want to first start with a couple of them on the Comply Chain app. The first one, Rachel, is the Comply Chain app recommended for U.S. companies only? Who should use the app?
The Comply Chain app is not just for U.S. companies. It's produced by the U.S. government, of course, but it's really produced as an open source tool. So I think it's especially useful for any companies that are finding themselves increasingly subject to some of the new laws that are coming out in various jurisdictions, whether it's the new EU requirements on non-financial reporting, or the new Dutch law, or the new French law on supply chain due diligence, or the Modern Slavery Act, and so on. So any company in the world that wants to manage its risks can use the tool. And we do try to market it not only as a resource for companies at the very top of the supply chain, in other words, the downstream brands and retailers, but also their supply chain partners going up the chain. And that means maybe getting back into some small and medium-sized companies whose brands are not widely known, but really have a lot of work to do on this kind of compliance. So we think it's versatile and can be used by a variety of different businesses.
Great. So, piggybacking on that, talking about companies that are a little further up in the supply chain, a question that some people have asked is the Comply Chain app available in other languages?
Yeah, that's a need that we've definitely become aware of. Well, we've been aware, but we didn't have the funding to translate it at first. But we now have found a way to do that. So we are in the process of translating the app into French and Spanish, and it should be published within this year in those languages as well, for people to use with their supply chain partners.
Great, thanks. And since we still look like we have a little bit of time, and we had a lot of questions that I think came in for the live program that will be of interest to anybody who's listening to this on replay, maybe we'll cover some of those. So the next question that I wanted to cover that a couple of people asked is whether, other than the U.S. Department of Labor resources, are there other guides or resources that the Comply Chain app references, and what other actors were consulted in the creation of the app? And I think you alluded to some of that at different points in your presentation, but maybe we can drill down on that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, we started developing the content for the app actually way back in 2010. And at that time, we did collect a lot of resources, and our initial draft was peer reviewed by a spectrum of different actors. So we had international labor union organizations review it, multilateral institutions, NGOs, academics, and then some of our own US government partners, as well as some businesses. And then since that time, the way we've continued to update it is by receiving input from all of the users. So if a company felt like they had a good example of one of the issues that we were describing in the supply chain, they would let us know about that, and we'd say, oh, can we use that? We do think this is really high quality. Can we use as an example in our next edition? So the Comply Chain app is actually the most recent edition of a publication that we've had out for a while, but it's the first time it's in mobile app form, and it's much updated and refreshed from the previous version. So I think it has been kind of an interactive process, and we want to continue to have it be that way, because we know in the field of social compliance, there's constant innovation. And so we want to hear about the new innovations and the new resources and be able to include them in the next version. In terms of some of the key resources that are in here, we do make quite a bit of use of materials coming out of some of the multilateral bodies like the OECD, the ILO, other UN bodies, because we're so closely tied in and linked with them and engaged with them so much. So I would highly recommend those resources. Also, I can't recommend highly enough the Responsible Sourcing Tool. That's just at www.responsiblesourcingtool.org. And as I said, that was actually funded by our sister agency, the State Department, but I think it's really relevant and useful to companies wanting to work on these issues. And it's a suite of tools. They're free. You can use them anonymously. You don't have to use all of them. But I would say I highly recommend that. And then I think it's just a matter of the company examples. There's so many companies who are innovating, and so the examples are kind of scattered throughout the Comply Chain content. And that might be the most interesting part, I think, for some users.
Great, thanks. So one more question on the Comply Chain app, and then we'll maybe address some of the other questions that came in. So somebody asked, does the Comply Chain app recommend how to scope for risk assessments or audits? And then a related question, how often should my company assess for risks in its supply chain?
Yeah. It does talk about how to scope for risk assessments or audits. I think the risk assessment section would get into how to even get started with assessing supply chain risks. The audit section would talk about the scoping of audits. That's a really tough question because, you know, so many audits are a one-day snapshot of a vast facility that it's really hard to get your arms around the situation in one day. But you got the budget for a day. So, you know, there's a discussion of the pros and cons of longer audits, shorter audits, more in-depth audits. How do you balance an audit with something else? Some other kind of due diligence so that you can find out what's going on with it, you know, while still keeping your budget in mind. And in terms of how often, I think it really depends on the sector. And I can't give specific, you know, specific numbers or timeframes for different sectors. I'm just not immersed in the world of it as much as that to really know. And I think it's a company by company decision. But I think probably the best resources for companies to get a better handle on that is to talk to peer companies who are in your sector and get a sense for how often they do it. So many industries now are starting to, as of about 20 years ago, but it's still developing, starting to have industry organizations where they work together pre-competitively on some of these social compliance issues. So whether it's electronics or apparel or toys or mining, you know, those industry groups can be one of the best resources to go to answer certain questions, certain more industry-specific questions.
Thanks, and I'll jump in on that one as well, because we're asked, you know, by companies all the time, is so, you know, how often should they assess for risk? How should they assess for risk? And I agree with Rachel. I mean, the lawyerly answer here is it depends, and every company is different. You know, as a practical matter, what we tend to see is at larger companies, risk assessment is a continual process. So not meaning that, you know, every day you're looking at every supplier, but rather, you know, you monitor relevant data. You're part of multi-stakeholder organizations that are looking at these issues. You're talking to peer companies, attending conferences and the like. And as a result of that, you know, you tend to have your finger on the pulse of where supply chain risk may be, not just as it relates to modern slavery, but across a whole different range of issues. You know, in terms of, you know, how frequently companies, you know, go out to suppliers, which I think maybe that's what was meant by the person who asked this particular question. You know, I think that, you know, what we see is companies tend to take a risk-based approach, and, you know, they don't treat every supplier equally. So maybe larger suppliers are examined more frequently, whether that's through audits or other sorts of formal assessments or questionnaires, however they decide to do it. Suppliers in higher risk jurisdictions are looked at more frequently, and then, you know, perhaps smaller suppliers and suppliers that are in lower risk jurisdictions are looked at less frequently. So taking this risk-weighted approach. So let's go on to another question that we received, and this one is piggybacks off of the STRT, and the question here was, if my supplier is found to be high risk after using the STRT, what are the next steps? How do I mitigate these impacts? The remediation step heavily focuses on audit results and remediating those impacts rather than questionnaire assessment remediation. This was a parenthetical that was as part of the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, step, I think it's 7 of the supply chain is the remediation step. And it's really built around this idea that there's 2 things you have to do when risks are identified. One is to put in place management systems to mitigate that those risks will happen again. For instance, when it comes to child labor, sometimes those management systems would be housed within the HR function, you know, making sure that there's certain kinds of required paperwork to show age, and that these things are kept on file, and that in the local context, we know who the relevant authorities are who would have, you know, proof of age. And the other side of the equation is that a company in its program has either people in place or expertise to draw from, maybe it's third party, on what to do if a victim is found. Because you don't want to be kind of caught off guard and without a plan. And there will be identification of people in abusive labor situations, probably, you know, the deeper you look in your supply chain. Almost everyone has it. And it's not something to be afraid of, it's something to work on and to be prepared to address. So I recently heard a company that I respect very much, a large UK-based retailer that has a very strong compliance program. I said to them, why isn't there more guidance and resources out there that tell companies exactly what to do when they find a child or they find a victim of modern slavery? What is the step-by-step? And he said, that guidance is growing and it's becoming more available, but it's still hard to come by because there really is not necessarily one decision tree. And to some degree, situations have to be treated on a case-by-case basis, but the important thing is for companies to have in place a person or a budget or resources of some kind whose job is to handle that situation and know who to go to and who to talk to handle it effectively. So I think those are some steps that you can take once you've identified a high-risk supplier or a risk in the supply chain. You can be prepared to put in place the management systems that need to be put in place and have at your disposal, or at least be thinking about, what's our plan when a victim is found, and what resources are we going to draw on at that point?
Thanks. And one thing I'll just also add to this, you know, we've seen a big change at companies over the last several to 10 years. You know, once upon a time, if companies saw issues in their supply chain relating to modern slavery. The immediate response was, get that supplier out of the supply chain, or get that country out of the supply chain if it was a high-risk country. And increasingly what we're seeing is that larger companies and more progressive companies, rather than disengagement, what they're looking for is to improve the situation. Certainly there's, some issues that, immediately there has to be remediation. Some issues are more, are more of a macro nature that affect a particular country or a particular region or a particular industry. And in those cases, what we're very frequently seeing is that companies are working with stakeholders on the ground in those regions to drive improvement, to drive awareness of issues, to increase reporting of issues, to help mitigate the risk of those issues, and then also working with their local partners, who are then, working with upper tiers in their supply chains as well. So the next question, and I think the last one that we want to cover for today, that was asked is, what internal stakeholders should be involved in the process? Does it vary depending upon the compliance step?
Yeah, great question. Actually, they've all been great questions, so thank you to those who did them. And there are one of the challenging things about working in compliance is that the actions that need to be taken are so cross-cutting across a company. And I've heard this from a lot of people who work inside companies within their CSR unit or their sustainability function, is that they have to do a lot of, I'm hearing more of the word intrapreneurship, being an entrepreneur, but within the company, to sell ideas, to build coalitions, to build support and understanding of the issues within the company. So that's a big part of the job. And it does depend on which part of the process you're talking about. So I mentioned some management systems that might need to be put in place throughout the supply chain would be HR related management systems. And there you really need to get your HR people on board and looking at how can they help you with tools and templates and processes that then need to be trained to the supply chain partners. A lot of the forward-leaning companies are building closer and closer bridges between their sustainability sides of the business and their purchasing or their sourcing. It's a lot easier to make sure that you're making that you're choosing business partners that are doing well on social compliance if you're working with the buyers that are actually making the deals with those supply chain partners. So, that depends, of course, on the company's model and how you source and whether you do licensing or and whether you're vertically integrated or not, and all of those factors. But certainly the purchasing or procurement function on the business is a huge part of it. And then more and more, these issues are rising to the attention of the C-suite, the board. Certain of the disclosures that are now required in some of the newer laws require CEO signature. So the issues are on the radar of more senior level people, and a lot of people, believe that without that level of leadership, it's harder to push compliance issues throughout the company and make it part of the company culture. So that's another challenge, but it's also one that is gaining more support, is having buy-in all the way up to the top and how that cascades to all the different business units and helps you with your job.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you not only for all your insights during the formal part of the program, but also for your insights during the Q&A. Let's go to our next slide. And I think that one speaks for itself, so let's go to the one after that, which is our last slide of the day. I just want to highlight a few other resources that today's attendees should be aware of. There are some past webinars that the SRA has put on. You can view those if you go to the SRA website. Also, is noted here, there's an FAQ and supplier guide that's there as well. And I know that for many of you on the phone, we're pushing out the link today to this webinar to you, but the webinar will also be available on the SRA website. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to reach out to Rachel with any additional questions, not only on things we specifically talked about on this webinar, but anything that's within her mandate more broadly. I think she's made it clear she is always talking to companies and is always looking to talk to companies to help them improve in this area. And then, of course, also feel free to, as I mentioned, reach out to any members of the STRT Development Committee, and all of those members are listed on the SRA website. With that, I want to thank everybody for attending today, and we look forward to your participation at the next SRA webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.